March 16, 1945, Luzon, the Philippines. 3 weeks after the Battle of Manila, and the air still hung thick with soot and the sour rot of burned bodies, the 6th U.S. Army was digging through the rubble of Japanese defensive lines, while Filipino civilians searched the ruins for the living and the dead. But behind the shattered walls of an abandoned warehouse in the northern outskirts, they found something else. At first, the GIS thought it was just another makeshift barracks. The smell of rot and urine was overpowering. Blood stained the concrete floor in black patches. Thin curtains had been strung across rusted scaffolding, barely dividing the space. Then one of the Filipino scouts called out, not in English, not in Tagalog, in Japanese. From the far corner, eyes blinked out from behind tattered cloth, pale, wide. A woman stepped forward, no weapon, no uniform, no words. She was barefoot, her lips cracked, her arms purpled with bruises. She was no soldier. She was one of dozens. What the Americans had found was not a barracks. It was a comfort station. Private Anthony Morales was the first to lower his rifle. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, backing up. "They're just girls." They were between 15 and 24. Most were Japanese, a few Korean, 1 or 2 Filipino. None of them had names they would speak aloud, only numbers scratched into the inside of their canvas sleeping mats. Captain Franklin Davies, a U.S. Army Medical Corps officer, arrived within the hour. He took one look inside and demanded a field hospital be erected on site. His voice was sharp, not with panic but purpose. "These are non-combatants," he told the MPs. "Get them out of here. I want blankets, hydration, nurses, now." The women flinched at his voice. To them, another man shouting in uniform meant another hour of pain. But what followed stunned them. A Japanese girl named Emmy was the first to be lifted into a U.S. Army ambulance. She tensed as the soldier wrapped a clean sheet around her shoulders. When he offered her water, she didn't move. When he repeated the offer in broken Japanese, she slapped the cup out of his hand. It wasn't defiance, it was conditioning. No man had ever offered her water without demanding something worse in return. But the soldier didn't strike her. He simply picked up the cup, poured a fresh one, and waited. When she finally drank, she wept. The comfort station had housed 31 women. 7 were comatose. 2 died within 24 hours of rescue. The rest were silent, broken, mistrustful, but alive. U.S. Army doctors ran triage under tents, assessing malnourishment, internal trauma, infection. No questions, no interrogation, just treatment. Private Susan Hart, a nurse with the 21st Evacuation Hospital, knelt beside a girl no older than 17 whose arm was wrapped in old wire as a tourniquet. "She doesn't speak," Hart whispered. "Maybe no one has listened in a long time," Davies said. They took off the wire, they gave her penicillin, they dressed her in clean linens. That night she tried to escape, not because she feared imprisonment, but because she didn't believe freedom could come without a price. Word spread among the 6th Army's divisions. The Japanese had left behind a system of sexual slavery in every occupied town, and the Americans were finding them one station at a time, in attics, brothels, old schoolhouses converted into cages. The initial reaction from the frontline soldiers was confusion. "They're the enemy's girls," one Marine said. "No," another replied, "they're the enemy's prisoners." By April, dozens of comfort women had been relocated to U.S. Army field care facilities across Luzon, and in every case, the pattern repeated. Shock, silence, and then disbelief, not at brutality but at mercy. They had been taught America would burn them alive. That surrender would be met with torture. That compassion was weakness, and Americans were animals. But what they saw were men with bandages and morphine, men who turned their backs when they bathed, men who brought food without demanding obedience. It was a kind of violence their minds weren't prepared for. Kindness. One girl, later identified as KO, had been forcibly conscripted from Nagoya at 16. She hadn't seen sunlight in 11 months. When the medics opened the doors to the truck and she felt wind on her face, she vomited. The sensation overwhelmed her nervous system. When an American nurse took her hand, she recoiled violently, until the woman offered a soft smile and said in Japanese, "You're safe." KO didn't sleep for 3 nights, not because she feared being taken again, but because she couldn't believe no one came to do it. Not every soldier knew what to do with them. Not every doctor was perfect. Some GIS stared too long. Some made offhand comments that set the girls trembling, but most understood. There was no war left in these women, only the aftermath. Emmy, whose bruises were healing slowly, finally spoke 5 days after her rescue. She approached Nurse Hart in the tent, pointed to her bandaged legs and whispered, "Why?" Hart didn't speak Japanese well, but the word was clear. "Why help me? Why fix what men had broken?" Hart knelt beside her, "Because you deserve to walk again." Emmy's lips quivered. Then, without speaking, she took Hart's hand and wept into her shoulder. General Walter Kruger, commander of the 6th Army, received a field report titled, "Recovered Non-Combatant Victims, Category, Comfort Stations, Luzon Sector." It included names, photos, translated accounts, and a disturbing summary of medical findings. He ordered it classified, then he ordered it copied, then he sent it straight to MacArthur. MacArthur never spoke publicly about the comfort stations, but he allowed the Army Medical Corps to expand their care for the rescued women and authorized silent relocation to secure areas. For the women, none of it made sense. Not the food, not the safety, not the silence. The only thing more unthinkable than the horror they had endured was the idea that someone had come to protect them. And meant it. The women called it the White Tent. It was nothing more than a U.S. Army field hospital set up under canvas, propped on bamboo poles, with cot lines and footlockers stacked with morphine and gauze. But to the survivors of the comfort station in northern Luzon, it felt like something from a different world. They sat silently, watching the nurses work. They flinched at the zip of stretchers and whispered to one another in Japanese, Korean, Tagalog, the words hard to translate because there were no words for what they were now. Not prisoners. Not property. But not quite free either. Some still expected punishment. Others waited for the soldiers to return. What none of them expected was the daily arrival of food. They fed them 3 times a day, not scraps, not rice boiled thin with salt, hot rations, real meat, powdered eggs, soft bread. Emmy ate with her shoulders tense, her legs curled beneath her as if she were expecting the bowl to be slapped from her hands at any moment. She chewed slowly, eyes darting. The nurse assigned to her, a freckled corporal named Jensen from Kansas, tried not to speak. Not yet, just sit, refill water, offer a folded blanket at night. Emmy never said thank you, but she never refused the food again. On the 5th day, one of the younger women began coughing up blood. She had been 19. Her name was Aiko. Davies called in the mobile surgical team. She was placed on a stretcher, her body limp and cold, and wheeled into the temporary operating tent. The other women watched through slits in the canvas, not because they were curious, but because they didn't believe it. In every camp they'd lived in, any girl who bled from the lungs was taken behind a barracks wall and shot. It was cheaper than medicine. But now they saw strangers, American doctors, slicing open their own rations to boil water, burning their gloves to sterilize tools, spending 4 hours to save a woman they didn't even know. Aiko survived. She would never dance again, but she lived. And the women saw. A week later, Emmy asked for soap. She whispered the word to Jensen in broken English. Sabun. Jensen blinked. Soap, she smiled. Yeah, I got soap. She brought a bar from her own pack, wrapped in wax paper. Emmy held it like it was gold. When she bathed that night alone, not watched, not rushed, just allowed, the other girls began to stir. The following morning, 4 more asked for soap. By that afternoon, the tent smelled of lye and lavender, the scent of civilians. It was the first time they had smelled like anything other than blood in a year. Lieutenant Haruko Abe had once been a nurse in Nagasaki. She had been assigned to the military comfort unit in Luzon 2 years earlier. On paper, she was logistics. In practice, she was the only thing standing between the girls and madness. She had tried to smuggle quinine. She had hidden needles. She had bandaged wounds the officers never saw. But after the retreat, she'd been left behind like the rest. When American medics found her, she did not speak. She expected to be shot. Instead, they gave her paper, pen, bandages. By the second week, she was helping with triage. Davies didn't speak Japanese, but he knew what competence looked like. She's one of them, Jensen said. She's also a nurse, Davies replied, and we need help. So Haruko worked beside the very army that had obliterated the one she served. She changed bedding, cleaned wounds, administered morphine under instruction. And at night, when the others slept, she sat under the tent's edge and stared out into the jungle. Not because she feared what was coming, but because she couldn't believe what hadn't come. The first letter arrived from Manila in late March. It was from the newly reopened hospital at Santo Tomas, where another group of liberated comfort women had been relocated. The stories matched: U.S. Army medics, warm beds, medical care. And no punishment. Word spread from camp to camp. They began whispering it like a prayer. They don't hurt us. They treat us. They protect us. Some refused to believe it. They still thought it was a trick, that the beatings would return, that the kindness was bait. But the beatings never came. In April, a field psychiatrist named Lieutenant Charles Nolan arrived to evaluate the psychological state of the rescued women. He took one look at their sunken eyes and trembling hands and said, "We're too late for therapy." But he stayed. He sat with them, notebooks in hand, sketching diagrams of trauma, not asking questions. One woman asked if he would take her blood. He said no. She asked again. "No," he repeated, "no one is taking anything from you." She burst into tears. Nolan wrote that moment down and underlined one sentence. Their trauma is measured not just by what was done to them, but by how they react to nothing being done. By May, the first group of recovered women was transferred to a secure facility outside Tacloban, under the care of the U.S. Army and Filipino nurses. They were given clothes, new documents, no uniforms. One girl asked if she would be put on trial. No, the interpreter told her, "You're not guilty." She didn't understand the words. The idea was too large. Not guilty. She had never even considered that as an option. At the Tacloban facility, they began to speak again. Not much, sometimes just names. Emmy wrote hers in the dirt, outside the barracks with a stick. A. M. I. Then she wiped it away with her hand. Not because she was ashamed, but because writing it once was enough. Someone had seen it. Davies never forgot their faces. Neither did Jensen, or Nolan, or the sergeants who had first opened the comfort station doors and expected to find soldiers. They carried the memory back with them after the war, in letters, in whispers, in moments of silence at kitchen tables in places like Ohio, Missouri, and Queens. They didn't always know how to explain what they saw. But they never forgot the look on a girl's face when she realized no one was going to hurt her. The rains came early in June. Typhoon winds ripped across the Vician Sea and battered the tents of the Army medical camp near Tacloban. Nurses scrambled to secure the canvas flaps. Men ducked under dripping roofs with clipboards and supplies in hand. Inside the women's barracks, Emmy pressed her back against the far wall, her arms wrapped around her knees. The thunder outside reminded her too much of what had come before: engines overhead, bombs that rattled the earth, and men's voices rising in the aftermath. But this time, the thunder brought no pain. No boots. No yelling. Just rain. And a quiet voice. Jensen sat beside her, wrapped in a poncho, offering a hot cup. She didn't speak. She didn't force. She just waited. Emmy took the cup and sipped, watching the water trace patterns on the canvas above. After a while, she asked softly, "Where will we go?" Jensen didn't have an answer, but she said what she could. "You won't be hurt." Emmy nodded. She had started to believe it, not completely, but enough to exhale. Lieutenant Nolan spent his nights reviewing field notes. In every camp where comfort women had been found, the story followed the same brutal arc: abduction, conditioning, exploitation, then abandonment when the front collapsed. But the recovery phase was harder to classify. Some girls refused food at first, others refused sleep. But almost all of them reacted the same way to American kindness, with fear. They weren't afraid of the violence. They were afraid of what it meant when violence didn't come, because it broke everything they had been taught. One afternoon, Haruko returned from the triage station and found the others whispering. Ko was holding a scrap of newspaper, an American military leaflet. The front showed photos of rescued POWs, Allied civilians who had been interned in Japanese camps. They looked like skeletons. And on the back, in 5 languages, a message: "The war will end. The world will not forget." Ko folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her sleeve. "They showed us this," she said, "because they think we're human." No one replied, but no one disagreed. News arrived from Okinawa in fragments. U.S. troops had landed in April. By now, the battle had become a bloodbath. Entire Japanese units were vanishing in cave networks and cliffside suicides. The doctors didn't share these updates with the women, but they felt the tension in the camp: more wounded, more amputations, more blood-soaked stretchers arriving every day. Still, the care never stopped. Every meal, every dressing change, every act of gentleness. The Army hospital had become a strange island in the middle of a war, still burning on all sides. One night, Emmy was jolted awake by the sound of screaming. Not English, not Japanese. A soldier, maybe Filipino, bleeding from the gut, dragged in from a skirmish up north. The medics worked for hours. At dawn, he died. Emmy sat outside her tent, watching the sun rise through the mist. Her hands were cold. Jensen brought her a jacket and sat with her. "I couldn't save him," Jensen whispered. Emmy looked at her. Then slowly she reached over and touched her arm. That was the first time, the first touch initiated by Emmy. The first gesture of comfort in return. Some of the women began asking questions, quietly, hesitantly. "Will we go back to Japan? Can we write letters? What happens if we're found by Japanese soldiers?" The answers weren't always easy. Some of the women were technically still listed as enemy nationals. Others had no papers at all. But Davies had spoken to his superior. "Put them under U.S. civilian protection," he'd said. "They're not combatants, they're not spies, they're victims." When the paperwork came through, the women were given identity cards. Name. Date of birth. Status: non-combatant civilian under U.S. protection. Some wept when they received them, others stared in disbelief. Ko held hers up to the light and said, "They gave us names again." The camp developed routines. Morning triage, physical therapy, meals, language classes, just a few English phrases scrawled on chalkboards. Yes. No. More. Safe. One girl asked how to say, "I don't want." Another asked how to say, "Please stop." A third asked how to say, "Thank you." They practiced together at night, whispering the words over and over. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Emmy struggled with the pronunciation. She laughed when she got it wrong. No one had heard her laugh in months. A letter came in from Manila, a repatriation order for several women. Their families had been located. A neutral embassy was negotiating return. Davies read the names aloud. Emmy was one of them. She froze. "Will I go alone?" she asked. Jensen shook her head. "You'll go with others." "And if I don't want to go?" "You don't have to," Jensen said. "It's your choice." Emmy didn't answer right away. The idea of choice was still new. The day before departure, the nurses gave her a small package, a set of hair ribbons and a bar of rose-scented soap. Inside the wrapper, Jensen had written, "No one owns you anymore." Emmy folded the note and placed it inside her shirt, close to her heart. The next morning she boarded the truck. She didn't look back, but she waved. And the women waved back. That night the others sat quietly in the barracks. Someone lit a candle. Someone hummed a lullaby. Someone whispered Emmy's name. Ko stood and said, "If they come for me next, I will go." Haruko nodded. "We all will when we're ready." The wind rustled through the canvas. Insects chirped in the trees beyond. The war was still out there, roaring in the distance. But inside the camp, for the first time in years, there was peace. Not total, not perfect, but real. August 6, 1945. It began with a whisper, then a rumor, then something close to disbelief. The word Hiroshima moved through the Tacloban hospital like smoke. The nurses passed it between themselves in clipped, urgent tones. The doctors stared at the bulletin sheets in silence. The GIS stopped talking altogether when they heard the casualty estimate. But the women, the survivors of Luzon, of the comfort stations, of the past 2 years of unending violation, didn't understand what had happened. A bomb. A city gone in a single flash. No air raid, no warning, just fire. The Americans didn't explain it fully, but they didn't hide it either. Nurse Jensen pulled Ko aside and tried to tell her gently. There was a weapon, a very large one. Ko frowned. More soldiers. No, one plane, one drop. Jensen looked away. It burned the entire city. Ko said nothing. But that night, when the storm rolled in and the wind made the tents shudder, she didn't cover her ears the way she used to. She just lay awake, eyes open, staring into the dark. 3 days later, the same whisper returned. This time it had a new name. Nagasaki. Haruko, once a nurse from that very city, was holding a stack of medical inventory sheets when she heard. Her hands trembled so violently she dropped them all. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply stood, staring at the floor, lips moving soundlessly. Ko placed a blanket over her shoulders. Emmy stood beside her. The three of them didn't speak. They didn't have to. It wasn't revenge they felt. It wasn't even grief. It was the collapse of a world they no longer belonged to. By mid-August, the orders came. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. The announcement was read aloud in the hospital courtyard by a Marine with a hoarse voice and trembling hands. He had survived 3 campaigns and still couldn't believe it. The Japanese nurses and civilians gathered outside the barracks to listen. They didn't cheer. They didn't move. They just stood, frozen, as if waiting for someone to revoke the news. But no one did. Major Tanaka, now a repatriated prisoner in another U.S. camp, wrote in his journal that night, "We have surrendered not just our army but our understanding of what we were. We said we fought for honor, but we built the comfort stations, and we left the girls behind." The Tacloban camp was different now. There were no more raids, no more evacuations, no more waves of wounded. Instead, there were ships filled with the wounded, the displaced, the broken, headed to wherever there was still room. Davies received a list of names, those cleared for repatriation. Some women asked to go home. Some asked not to. Some had no homes to return to. Ko was offered a spot on a ship to Nagasaki. She declined. "Nothing is waiting there," she said. Haruko planned to return. She still had family, maybe. She didn't know. Emi didn't speak about her decision. She just packed her things and stood in line when her name was called. On the morning of her departure, Jensen hugged her, a real hug, not a formal one. "You're going to be okay," she said. Emi looked at her. "I already was," she whispered, "here." Lieutenant Nolan left his last report in a sealed envelope. It wasn't filed through official channels. It was addressed to the Army Surgeon General, handwritten on yellow pads in pencil. He titled it "The Quiet War." It ended with one line: "We rescued them from cages, but they taught us what survival really looks like." In the final weeks of the camp's existence, the women began to sing again. Not loudly, not like before the war, whenever that had been. Just quiet songs, childhood rhymes, soft notes in the early mornings while folding linens or brushing their hair. For the first time, they did not whisper to one another out of fear. They spoke plainly, their names, their memories, and what they had survived. Davies watched them from the edge of the medical tent, arms crossed, a stethoscope dangling from one hand. He said nothing. He didn't need to. He had seen enough. They left in small groups, some on troop ships, some on converted hospital vessels, others in convoys guarded by MPs who had never pointed their rifles at them. The departures were quiet, almost ceremonial. No one saluted. No flags were folded. The women were not returning as heroes, but they weren't leaving as prisoners either. They were something else now. Survivors. The American nurses lined up at the edge of the pier. They hugged them, handed them small bundles, soap, cloth, letters, worn books, things with no tactical value and infinite weight. Haruko was the last to leave from Tacloban. She paused on the dock, the sea wind pulling at her coat. She turned once, met Davies' eyes, and gave the faintest bow. He returned it, nothing more, that was enough. In Tokyo, months later, when the war crimes tribunals began, photographs were shown. Comfort stations, rusted beds, chains, ledgers filled with names written in 2 languages, the girls, birthplaces, service schedules, dosages of morphine. Most of the American soldiers who testified did not talk about tactics or battle maps. They talked about faces. One said, "I thought I was fighting monsters, then I saw what monsters did." Another, "We were trained to shoot, but when we found the girls, all we could do was listen." Their testimony didn't stop the arguments. Some Japanese officers denied it all. Others said it was necessary. A few said they were sorry. But the record was made. And the names were written down, not numbers, not ranks, names. Emi ended up in Osaka. She ran a laundry and then later a boarding house for women without families. She never married. She didn't speak of Luzon. But every year on August 15th, she lit a candle in her window. Not for the emperor, not for the war. For the tent. For the soap. For the nurse who had said, "You're safe now." Ko eventually returned to Nagasaki. There was nothing left of her childhood home. Her parents were gone. Her brother had died in Burma. She stayed anyway. She worked as a clerk in a public records office. she kept to herself. But she wrote long letters, dozens of them. Some were mailed, most were not. They were addressed to no one, or to the girls who never made it out, or to the nurse who taught her to say thank you in English. Jensen moved back to Kansas, married a man who never asked about the war, had 3 children. But every spring, she opened a worn wooden box in her attic. Inside, a red armband, 2 black and white photographs, and a folded card with a name written in soft Japanese ink. She read it every time, even though she'd memorized it years ago. Then she would close the box and smile. No medals were issued for what the doctors did. No documentaries were made. Most of the records were archived and forgotten. But in field journals, in private letters, in the backs of drawers across 2 continents, fragments remain. A note in a nurse's diary. She asked me what dignity meant. I couldn't explain it, so I washed her hair instead. A photo of 2 girls holding hands, neither looking at the camera. A prescription slip with a name written in katakana and a dosage in pencil. History moved on. But somewhere between the noise of tanks and treaties, between the ruins and the rebuilding, something else had happened. In the quiet corners of army tents, on rusted cots and dirt floors, American medics had done something unthinkable. They had chosen to protect the women the world had discarded. Not because it was policy, not because it was strategy, but because it was right. And because, after all the horror, it was the one thing left worth doing. The city of Manila had begun to breathe again, but only in short, careful gasps. Streets that once echoed with boots and gunfire now carried the sound of hammers, wheels, and shouted orders in 3 languages. Burned buildings were scaffolded in bamboo. Markets reopened beneath sheets of salvaged corrugated tin. In the southern ward near the ruins of Intramuros, the U.S. Army established a new headquarters for displaced civilians. It was surrounded by barbed wire, but the gates were open. Medical tents ringed the inner courtyard. The flag that hung above the checkpoint was American, but the people inside spoke Japanese, Korean, Tagalog, and English in mismatched fragments. They didn't know where they were going, only that they were no longer where they had been. Among them was Ko. She had arrived in a troop truck with 3 other women, none of them speaking, and stepped down into the Manila dust with a bundle of clothes and a folded paper from Tacloban. A corporal scanned the letter and waved her through. Civilian evacuee, priority protection. Ko didn't understand the words, but she recognized the tone. It was the same tone the American nurses had used when they pulled her from the jungle and into the tent months ago. Not pity, not apology. Duty. She walked through the checkpoint and didn't look back. The yard inside was crowded, makeshift canvas shelters, rows of cots, babies crying in Filipino, nurses calling names, men missing legs and women missing children. No one asked where she had come from. No one asked what had been done to her. They handed her a toothbrush, a cot, a name tag, and a schedule. Ko folded the tag into her shirt pocket. It said, "Civilian Repatriation Hold." She lay on the cot and stared at the tent ceiling until night fell. The city around her was silent. For the first time in months, there were no bombs. Only rain. The Manila hospital was larger, colder, more crowded than Tacloban. The nurses didn't speak Japanese. The food was different, less rice, more bread. But the routine was familiar. Roll call at sunrise, medical checks twice a week, counseling optional, movement restricted but not enforced. Ko followed the rules. She spoke when spoken to. She waited in line. She washed her tray and folded her blanket and kept her eyes down. But she watched. One day, she saw a Korean girl flinch when an American soldier dropped a metal tray. The sound had reminded her of something loud, something violent. Ko knew the moment, knew it by the way the girl's shoulders locked, her breath caught. She walked over, sat down beside her, and without asking held her hand. The girl cried, not loudly, not for long, but she didn't pull away. After that, others came to Ko, not for food, not for help, just to sit. They called her Wanesan, older sister. And she listened. There were fewer doctors now. Most had been reassigned. The war in Europe had ended. Tokyo was under occupation. The men with clean boots and silver eagles on their shoulders were making maps for a future that didn't involve tents and women with haunted eyes. But one doctor remained. Captain James Rowan, Navy medical, quiet, mid-30s, hands too large for the scalpels he carried. He arrived with a satchel and a clipboard, and asked to speak with Category E female civilians. He was directed to Ko. She didn't like him, not at first. He reminded her of the men who came into the station in Luzon, shoulders squared, eyes hard, mouth too careful. But Rowan didn't ask about pain. He didn't ask what had happened. He asked if she wanted to help others. She said yes.